Hello, are you there? Okay, good. Nice to see all of you. We're in Sierra Vista, I think you know that, and I want to thank you all for coming today. We're really excited to have Dr. Ramirez from ASU. This is not some revolutionary thing that there's somebody from ASU here speaking to us. People were actually nervous about that. They thought you might be a spy.
Oh my goodness.
We take rivalries very seriously here.
When's the game?
I'm not a fan, so I don't know. That's just what people said. Anyway, so Pablo is not here as a spy. He's here because his work is really closely aligned with the work that we do here, and the work he's going to talk about today is border pedagogy, which is not something that we've addressed directly in the program yet. So it's an opportunity for you to have, first of all, a broader view of faculty in this area, so you can see how the work that we're doing fits into a broader research agenda that Pablo's part of. But also, it's just great to have somebody here who has a different perspective. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And they're all yours. We've sort of warmed them up for you. So
you've been here already, early in the morning?
These guys have been here since 9 o'clock.
All day.
Sounds like the good old days. I remember when I did my master's in California, I would have to take classes in LA.
Oh my
Saturday,
gosh.
so it was a 2-hour drive. So I feel what you're feeling in terms of Saturday and then working full time. I appreciate you coming. So let me start out first by saying my name is Dr. Pablo Ramirez from Arizona State University. I work for the Maryland Teachers College. I've been there for six and a half years. Today, I will spend time talking about research and a research article that I worked on about a year and a half ago. So before I start, I want to make sure that to say the following is that I will be sending Dr. Karlovic the article that was published, the volume that I published it in, which is the volume that I edited about a year and a half ago.
Okay.
So all of you will have access to this information. I will also forward you the PowerPoint and anything else that I think is valuable. But the article and the work has already been published in the high school journal. So I will send it to
these guys have your article in their D2L site. So I
the high school?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I said,
You got it already.
well, you think they've read it? No, but I mean, it's in there, and I asked them to look at it because I think it's a really good example of qualitative research too.
Okay.
So not only for the topic, but also for the method.
And I'll forward you the issue, which has qualitative research at a national level.
I'd love to see that, yeah.
Carolina, and from California. So again, welcome all. I'll talk a little bit about my background, and then I'll go into my study, and then I want to spend some time to ask you and have a discussion about how this could be informative to your particular research, the particular classroom, the particular communities that you work for next steps. So at the end of the session, I want to sort of take time to think about a plan of action that you may want to engage in your area of work. So I'll talk a little bit about myself. I was an elementary school teacher in Southern California, in San Diego, California, which is about 20 minutes away from the Tijuana, Mexico border. I was a multilingual teacher for several years, and then moved on to high school. Those of you that taught high school know that there's a significant difference between working with small children and secondary youth. As a high school teacher in California in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a particular educational movement come into place. Aspects of No Child Left Behind, aspects of other educational reforms that sort of made us think about how we were going to work with all learners, but specifically diverse language learners. And what we found, from my experience as a high school teacher, is that number one, a lot of the curriculum that I used in California was culturally irrelevant, nothing new, and we were getting into the beginning stages of standardization, explicit standardization. So as a high school teacher, I sort of got a sense of, I didn't know anything about culture responsive teaching or border pedagogy, but I got a sense of if a high school kid doesn't see the curriculum as meaningful or your lessons as meaningful, how are we going to engage them? How are we going to tap into those academic assets that they have, those cultural assets that they have? So as a secondary high school teacher, I got a sense of what was occurring with some of my students, Latino and non-Latino, English and non-English. And so it propelled me to do my master's in education and in literature, and propelled me to do my research at Claremont and UC Irvine, where I looked at specifically the way in which teachers engage with diverse communities using bilingual education theory, culture responsive pedagogy, all through a qualitative research lens. So I've had 18 years in the business of education, and I continue to learn. And so my research today talks about a framework that is not new, but the way in which we use it in secondary settings is sort of, in a way, innovative. Meaning that border pedagogy, and I'll talk about this, just like multicultural education, has existed since the late 1960s, right? And we saw the emergence of how to work with culturally diverse populations. However, in 2017, we have all these great innovative curriculum ideas, but where the issue arises is how schools, school districts, and administrators support or not support innovative pedagogies, extraordinary lesson plans, or critically engaging discussions with students, both Latino and non-Latino. Because when I talk about border pedagogy, I'll expand on how it's used in a contemporary lens. So I want to talk in particular, so I talked a little bit about that already. So border pedagogy, let me ask you this question. How many of you have had experience with this particular pedagogy, either through your readings, discussion with friends, schools, here in Arizona or outside Arizona? Yes.
Last year, as first year teachers, we interacted with it in one of our cultural, I forget the name of the class, but cultural equity, basically. And so we went over how pedagogy differs from being close to the border versus, middle of the country, and
yes,
what's included, but we just touched upon it a little bit.
So border pedagogy sometimes, historically, the definition has been constrained to just a regional definition, meaning if you live close to the border, if you live here, or California or even Texas, that the critical work that you do with those communities considered border pedagogy. But today, I'm going to expand on it and say that you can be in North Carolina, you could be in Mississippi, where we have an emerging refugee and immigration population, and enact aspects of border pedagogy. So in the past decade, border pedagogy has been considered useful in border towns, which are towns in the U.S.-Mexico border. However, with the increase of immigrant and refugee populations in U.S. communities, the role of border pedagogy has expanded to non-border communities. Anzaldua argued that historically marginalized youth are constantly living in the shadows due to the cultural differences. And I'll talk about Anzaldua's work as I talk about the literature review with border pedagogy. So I want you to think of border pedagogy as something that is not contained to a regional area, but more at a broader area. I would even consider it using it in a global perspective, how it could be used. And then I want you to think about how as individuals, these sort of metaphysical borders that exist, these psychological borders that exist as individuals. So keep those two lines of thought going. And so the research question that I asked is concerned with understanding how border pedagogy influenced Latino and Latina teachers and students in school communities. Most specifically, I wanted to know how teachers enacted border pedagogy in an urban high school setting. So we have this interesting idea. Can it be done? Most of the research tells us that culturally responsive teaching, as example, is not enacted in schools. In fact, the research that's come out of Mount St. Clair University in New Jersey, where Tamara Lucas has done extensive research on culturally responsive teaching, has confirmed that being able to enact culturally responsive pedagogy or something like border pedagogy is actually very difficult for several reasons that I will expand on today. I don't want to talk about the demographics, but I do want to say, I do want to talk a little bit about this, which is the third point. And this is where, as a high school teacher, as a grad student, and now as a professor at ASU, I continue to go back to what is occurring with a lot of our students. So current research on secondary ELLs reveals that many are following academically, consequently influencing an increase in high school dropout rates at a national level. So as a teacher, as a grad student, now as a researcher, I've always thought about, so how can we help all our students, but specifically the ones that have been marginalized historically? How can we figure out ways in which we can academically support the academic achievement of these particular youth? And this question, scholars, educators, people like you have been asking for a century, I would say. So it's something that is not new, but as high school folks, the people that work in secondary school settings, our question still is, what innovative pedagogies or ideas can we use to support historically franchised populations, right? And so this question was used within the context of this particular high school, which I will talk about later on. And so I use in my literature review Giroux's work on what we call border crossers, physically and symbolically. So Giroux's concept of border crossers includes both the physical and metaphysical movement that students are engaged in constantly. Giroux affirmed that border crossers are individuals that live in two worlds with different values, systems, traditions, understandings, and have the ability to intersect these to experience this into of their own dual identity. So, border crossers are not just people that come from Mexico, Central America, but are people that are actually engaged in two worlds. The world that exists outside of the community and the world that exists inside the school. Two worlds, right? So Giroux's work, which he published an article in our issue, and Etta, you will have this. Henry Giroux of UCLA, and now he's retired, has always been at the forefront of engaging discussions around border pedagogy. And he consistently talks about how diverse students, even white students, have multiple cultural identities. And what he seeks is for us to understand that students, specifically in high school, which is what my research is about, have so many multiple and rich identities that because of several constraints, we sometimes do not have access to them, or do not create this optimal learning environment where those particular identities sort of emerge. And so I use Giroux's work to sort of guide the research and sort of echo what has occurred in the past. Gloria Anzaldua, one of my favorite critical theorists and feminists out of UC Santa Cruz. She didn't finish her dissertation because she died of diabetes. But does anyone know Gloria Anzaldua's work? Gloria Anzaldua is a critical feminist that engaged in discussion of duality and border pedagogy. She wrote a particular book that's been an exemplar at a national and international level called Borderland. But in particular for my literature review, I used her work to talk about Nepantla. Nepantla is considered so I'll start this. Nepantla is considered a liminal place where an individual doesn't belong either here or there. It's sort of at the intersect of a place that can't be labeled. Meaning, if I'm Latino, if I'm Mexican American, there are some times where I don't consider myself Mexican. When I go to the South America or Central America, they look at me as, hey, here comes El Gringo. Gringo? El güero, el güero. Oh, my grandparents, my aunts, my cousins, you're Anglo. What's the matter with you? You don't understand what we're going through. Okay, I understand. Now I come to the United States. I was born in Los Angeles, big Dodger fan, by the way. And I go into areas where they're like, do you speak English? Right? Understand the presentation? And so, for various people, not just from white folks, but from various. And so we live in these two spaces. I have a lot of gay lesbian students, and we ask them, as conversations with my grad and doc students, living in these two spaces, how is it possible, right? So Anzaldua believes in Nepantla, this liminal space where we are neither from here or there. And the discussion, sort of what seminal works of Hooks, Hooks talks a lot about the other. You know, a lot of students in these days and historically have been placed in these marginalized sort of shadowy areas called the other. And so this research, her work and Giroux's work, has influenced a lot of what has occurred in the world of pedagogy, both in the United States and internationally. So I use a theoretical framework that looks at three particular lenses. I wrote them in Spanish, but I will translate them. Conocimientos comes from Anzaldua's work of understandings. How do we understand ourselves as a human being? How do teachers truly see themselves in their students as complete human beings with the capacity to be? Freddie talks a lot about the communication process. We're constantly with our students. I've been to many high schools in California, Arizona, where the teacher talks 99.9% of the time, right? And when we ask them questions of how are your students engaged? They say, yes, they are. They are very engaged. They're quiet, they're listening, they're taking notes. And let me tell you something, I came up through that system where if you're writing, taking notes, and being quiet, you're engaged. A star for you. And what I'm saying is that level of engagement is significant. But what we know is that understanding students as complete human beings and understanding that particular notion is key. So conocimientos or understandings comes from Anzaldua's work. I also draw from Valenzuela's work with caring or cariño. Valenzuela has talked, for the past 25 years about how caring teachers and the relationship that they build with students has a significant impact on how they engage in schools, on how they engage in their communities, and I think equally important is how they achieve academically. The last lens, concientización, critical consciousness, comes from Freire's work, which talks about this critical consciousness that we as teachers must be always thinking about as we work with diverse populations, as we work with school politics and other policies that may impact the way you teach. So, conocimientos, caring, and critical consciousness, o concientización, are these lenses that guided my research with in this particular study. So I want to stop right here. Any questions so far about anything? I want to pause a little bit. If something is not clear, please, at any time, please stop. So I'll talk about this my school setting. So the school setting takes place in San Carlos County, which is a pseudonym. It's in Chula Vista, California. This is where I grew up. So it takes this is a very personal case study. But in this particular high school, in this particular area, many of the students were placed in Monte Vista High School, another student. And this particular high school is what the research calls, like Valencia calls, it's the dumping ground, where kids that are not good in English, are not meeting the grades, are always late, are always transient, get dumped. It's considered a traditional, it's considered a non-traditional school where students could actually take classes every day, but their schedule is modified to meet the needs of the student. So it's a very progressive school. However, I wanted you to know this, that the students that are in this school, and I'll talk about the high school, are kids that other high schools in that region were not able to support, or for whatever reason said they were not making the grade, their English wasn't proficient, and they were simply, because of their lateness, their absences, were sent to this particular school. So in this high school, and I'll talk a little bit about this, in this high school, I'll go back to in this high school, it's a Title I school that receives federal funds to assist students with instructional resources. In 2014, 708 students were enrolled at Monte Vista High School. An overview of student demographic information is displayed. You'll have an article. Basically, mostly Latino. The majority are classified as English learners. However, I'll show you the students. Because this, I'll talk a little about the students at the school site. Because this phenomenon is occurring, I believe, based on the research and based on my work in California and Arizona, the student demographics and the student diversity is reflective of this particular sort of frame that I'm going to show you. So in high schools, what I'm noticing, in particular in Monte Vista High School, we had a large chunk of Latina students, but we also had transnational youth in Mexico, in Tijuana, in the last 10 years. Many students from Central Mexico, South America, and the last 5 years, we've gotten students from Haiti and from other Caribbean countries. So we have a real mix of students that come into that particular high school. And so in terms of the language spoken and non-spoken, we have a lot of emergent bilinguals. These are kids that spoke Spanish and English at home. We also had Latinos that only spoke English. And last but not least, transnational youth, the kids that came from everywhere. These kids were considered newcomers. Some spoke Spanish, some spoke no Spanish, some spoke no English or no Spanish. So a lot of these kids are not just Latino or Latina, they're coming from a variety of regions, right? And they're coming for X amount of factors, right? The push and pull factors of the parents who want to work here, and they have these communities that are being set up. This, ladies and gentlemen, is occurring in many urban, and I'd even say non-urban areas. In North Carolina, if you read the issue, you'll see an article written by Claudia Cervantes-Soon and others that have written about the fact that we have now when you think about English learners, we have to broaden that particular definition to say that we have kids from many places that are coming in with their own language. It could be Tagalog, it could be a different language. And so it makes this very complex. So how can word pedagogy, which Gloria Anzaldua, I think she was just thinking of the other, but in terms of contemporary times, how can word pedagogy be used with a diverse population? Right? Is it even possible? All of this is just a way to engage in discussion. Word pedagogy is not a recipe. As you know, each and every one of these populations have a variety of linguistic capital, a variety of academic capital, a variety of cultural capital. In addition, and this is where the issue of border pedagogy and duality comes into play. These populations are also integrated with white, Asian Americans, different populations. So what we have now in 2017 is a very cosmopolitan way of looking at kids, particularly in high school, and particularly in rural and non-rural areas. So I always get upset when teacher coordinators, professional development folks at high schools come in with the agenda of saying, these are English learners, and this is what you need to do. It is actually broader and more complex. So the border pedagogy is just a way for us to engage and the possibility of sort of understanding some of our students, okay? So, I talk about more of this stuff. My methodology, I do mostly qualitative work. The data from this research study is part of a larger qualitative study on border pedagogy and Latino in Southern California. We use multiple case study approach to collect and examine the ways in which two teacher participants use border pedagogy and this high school. So I used case study research and critical ethnography to look at both the way teachers engage inside the classroom and outside the classroom. So we're looking, again, going back to the title, the title of the article, how is word pedagogy enacted in multiple spaces? So what I'm getting at here is we tend to learn more about our students outside the classroom, right? How many of you are currently high school teachers or in the, is it true or is it a myth? I've always been 50-50, but the last 10 years it's been like, I learned more about the kids that are always quiet outside. And sometimes we as educators don't have the ability to learn from them on these outside settings. It is very important as a researcher to be conscious of your positionality. And I'm very direct and to what I do. So one, this is my community. I've lived in Chula Vista for many, many years. As a Latino former high school teacher, I have a particular perspective of how I see education. And so I lived in border communities for many, many years, and I'm living now in border communities, both in Glendale and in Tucson. My parents, immigrants from Mexico, my family. I have friends and colleagues from different nationalities that have experience. So all these particular factors have influenced my research positionality. So I'm looking at the research in a particular way. Not to say that it's extremely subjective, but the subjectivity helps me understand some of these particular perspectives that came out of my research. So positionality is key. So I'm looking at it. So in one way, I have this background and experience. On the other hand, I'm very critical of what I found. So I have an understanding, and at the same time, I'm going to challenge and critique what I see. So your positionality as emerging scholars and teachers and researchers helps you because it's not just being subjective, but also having a criticism grounded on what I talked already about before. So I just want to point that out. I don't want you to think that, oh, this guy just went to his hometown, observed, boom, 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 article published. No, it's actually difficult to go back to your community, people that know you, and schools and principals and administrators saying, what are you doing here? I have questions. I have questions. And most administrators, if most administrators, I have to admit, want the best for their kids. I really do. I gotta believe it. I have to believe it. Because they want the best for their teachers, and they want kids to do well. We might have some administrators that think otherwise, but I do. I go in there with that belief. I'm very optimistic. Some people have said, are you delusional? I have to be delusional. I have to be an optimist. Because if we're not, then we're in trouble. We're in deep trouble, right? So again, is engaging with your communities, engaging with folks that may not believe in culture responsive pedagogy or border pedagogy, but that dialogue, the conversations that you have with folks are key. Okay, so you might be doing research where some of your stakeholders are like, you're doing what and why? It's important to have those conversations with them, to engage, not to teach them, but to inform them, right? To be able to be a student, sort of think through these processes, to get at your research, to get at what you want to do. So my participants, the teachers in the study were recruited between February and April 2014. In 2014, we developed a list of potential participants for this study, utilized rigorous participant selection process, and we developed a protocol for identifying potential participants. We communicated with schools, teachers, and educators in Ola Vista, California that had experience with border pedagogy. Further, we received participant recommendations for the study. We started with a list of 15 potential participants, and only 6 volunteers to participate in screening interviews. We conducted interviews with 6 and 4 met the criteria. Of the 4 teachers, 2 volunteered to participate. And I want to say this, those of you that are going to be conducting your research soon, this is a very difficult process. I wanted to select teachers that were actually not just engaged, either through their readings or conversation, but had experience enacting border pedagogy in the high school settings. And so we went from teachers that read about this particular literature to teachers that actually were doing it. And it went from like 15 all the way down to about 4, which is normal. I think that sort of, I was confident. I was like, can't have 20 people doing this. I haven't seen it. Maybe in some particular districts, yes, but it's very difficult to actually see teachers engaged in some of this work. So we had 2 teachers, Ms. Marisol Chavez and Mr. Tommy Soto. Marisol taught literacy, and Mr. Tommy Soto taught social studies. Of course, there are limitations. I'm limited to 2 teachers. So the data that I collected was the classroom and community observations that I collected. So that in itself. However, even with the findings that came about the work, I do believe that there is significance. In particular, what I found out about the 2 teachers and how they engage with their students. So the limitations existed. For those of you that are thinking about research, always go back. So I've gone back to the community to expand it, to think about other school districts that are doing this work. And again, very minimal. And so again, I just wanted to state that so that it's clear that there are limitations to the study. So a lot of the work that I did as a doctoral student and also the work that I've done in Arizona wants to consider factors that completely limit what teachers can do in terms of just innovation. A lot of the work that I've done with culturally responsive teaching, which is sort of very synonymous with border pedagogy, is not enacted in school. And the reason why is the following. So you could have the views of CRT as part of your arsenal to say, I believe in student validation, I believe in student empowerment, I believe in transformation. So if you are a pre-service teacher or even in-service teacher, these particular perspectives inform and guide and sort of shape your beliefs, your role. However, what the research has told us for the last 25 years, that institutional policies ultimately end up shaping who you are as a teacher. So we have federal policies, school policies, and particular school programs that once you step into the schools, whether it's high school, middle school, elementary, there's a particular expectation from you. And what we know from Giroux's work, Anzaldua's work, from Gandra's work and others, is that most teachers immerse into the culture of the school. So the work that these teachers enacted with word pedagogy is extraordinary. Okay, but I want to link it to, also I want to give this an Arizona perspective. So in Arizona, high school kids, in particular, in particular, high school kids that are considered English learners continue to be what? Segregated, right? The 4-hour block puts kids that may be very talented in Japanese or in French, but because of their English proficiency, they are placed in a 4-hour block. So, if you are a teacher and you believe in some of this culture responsive teaching, and you're a good math teacher, and you're a good social studies teacher, and you want to know your kids, well, it's hard to know your student if your student's not in class. So again, in terms of contemporary and the context of Arizona and also California, the stuff that I did was in California, considered a progressive state. No, it's not. There are issues that go way back. But what I'm telling you is in high school, in Arizona, we have a difficult time engaging with our secondary youth, especially if that language variation. And so on the one hand, I can teach you about cultural responsiveness and pedagogy. On the other hand, we have policies that begin to shape the way in which you look at your kids and your students. In high school, I worked with in-service teachers at Central High School that say that I taught in underground work, and we talked about multicultural literature, literacy, being good English teachers. Don't just think that I'm being extremist. For example, I have awesome English teachers and awesome math teachers that only speak English, but they're very creative, they're very innovative, they think outside the box, and that is the greatest. When those things start happening, it's great. However, even my teachers that have those perspectives don't engage with these kids that have these backgrounds. They see them, for example, my English or my history teachers, in many instances, won't see them. For example, if you're an English teacher that teaches English, the traditional mainstream English class, you may not see a particular student that you see walking in as a 9th grader. You may not see them at all. And you're a 9th grade English teacher. Social studies, which I saw a lot. You may have a kid that's been in what we call a remedial English class for 4 hours. Sort of come to your class, being with the same group of students in the same environment, and now you see them. And when you see them, things have happened. So a lot of this is not blaming our teachers, but blaming these other factors that begin to impact the things that occur with students. So in many cases, and what I've noticed, in many cases, students come in and they're sort of mentally dropped out, or mentally tapped out, or their schooling experiences are not as positive as we as teachers that perhaps have engaged with them hasn't been congruent. So we see a lot of kids not sort of having this positive experience with school. And this is applicable to both California, Arizona, and at a national level. Now, is this also expanded to white students? Yes. Yes. And I'll talk about this in a little bit. And so let me talk about my participants. Ms. Marisol Chavez was a 30-year Mexican-American literacy teacher. She was born and raised in Oro Vista and been a teacher at Mundos High School for the past 8 years. She lives in Oro Vista, is an active community member. She describes her beliefs about teaching at Mundos Vista High School. I always think of the Latina girls that are always told to be quiet or to shut up. I hate the feeling of not having a voice or identity. I was raised by a strong mom who showed me the value of being bilingual, having dual voices, and identity. This is who I am. So this particular participant has this ideology already set. She had a lot of Latinas in her classroom, but she also had white students. And so the issues about speaking up came up a lot in the research and how she engaged with students. Tommy Soto's 37-year-old Latino social studies teacher and taught in Mundos Vista High for the past 10 years. He was born in Tijuana, Mexico, so about 20 minutes away, and lived in Florida community for the past 18 years. In an interview, Tommy expressed his beliefs. I am from Tijuana, California, so I embrace both worlds in everything that I do. The students that I teach, I always tell them that we have and live in beautiful worlds, rich in Latino culture. Both are connected to me, and that is how I teach. We are all connected. So Marisol is not from the Tijuana Mexican border region, but she identifies with her students in other ways. Tommy, social studies teacher, actually lived in Tijuana and crossed a lot and has that experience. And so I want you to get the sense that we have a variation even within these participants who are teaching some of this work. So some of the emerging findings, or even some things that came out, let me talk about the students, because a lot of this, if you haven't read the article, there's a lot of narrative on what the students said. So newcomer students, and I'll stop for a little bit and ask you, for the past 2 decades, newcomer youth have been underachieving in education studies. Newcomers are students who English is not their first language. Newcomer youth are characterized as students that have some or no formal education in their country of origin, have interrupted schooling due to several extraordinary societal and educational factors. Have the concept or term of newcomer youth come up in your school, your community, in your discussions or readings, in your courses or anything? Yes.
So you're not really just talking about a newcomer to the school, you're actually talking about a newcomer back into education.
Yes, yes. In many instances in high school, in Oro Vista, we had high school kids that would go to the traditional high school, and they would make it one because they were new to the country, they were new to education. They didn't know about 6 periods. They didn't know about the cafeteria. They didn't know about counseling, nursing. This is brand new. A building for school was brand new. In many instances, we've had kids from Haiti, that didn't go to school. They worked. And so they didn't have this impression of education, and the schooling was sort of imagined and sort of was formed once they got there, and did not have success. So many of those kids, those newcomer youth, entered Oro Vista, where they took, again, I don't want to be negative, but it was considered the dumping ground where kids that had these issues came in and sort of revitalized in a way. Not to mean, I want to say this, not to say that they were going to be saved. I want you to be clear on that. We're not saving kids. We're giving them opportunities. So it's an equal. So the teacher puts in the effort using diverse frameworks, and the kids feel that it's meaningful. So we're not saving. It's there. So there's a mentality of the deficit view of saving kids. Oh, look at poor Michael or poor Maria. This is more of opening up, understanding their cultural assets and linguistic assets to gain access. versus saving, right? Those are two things that we have to, for instance, as a young teacher growing up, pobrecito, I'm gonna help you. In Spanish, I will help you. That saver mentality was there, but my expectations were low. With this work, teachers maintained the academic rigor high, and so we had these particular folks had high expectations. So we're not saving you, we're opening up, we're giving them access and sort of challenging them, okay? There are two things that newcomer youth typically have teachers that have these deficit perspectives of education. I would like to think that that's changing because there's more PD and there's more work being done in this area. But still, hey, if funding is bad, I'm gonna say this. If funding is not allocated to learn about all our kids, or some, and space and time in our schools, then all our kids are impacted, right? All our teachers are impacted, which is the research that I do. If my teacher, whether she's white, Latina, non-Latina, if she doesn't have time to reflect about her kids, her curriculum, how she can be innovative, how she can be creative, how he or she, then that's going to impact. That's going to impact, as you know, this impacts your work. So newcomer youth have historically been the most underachieving in terms of high school settings. Those kids, again, that don't have the schooling experiences, that have severe language difficulties. Okay, so I just want to expand a little bit on that. So the first particular finding that comes out was cariño or care in border context. And the majority of my soul students were Latino. She stated that she used literature activities that empower youth to study using feminist Latino texts. She is a feminist, and she was very, very direct. However, she also negotiated a lot of the space that a lot of the things that she did, she negotiated with her students and with her school. And this is what she said with the process that she used. I'm a feminista, so I want my girls to have multiple ways of thinking and learning. I want my students to know that their voice is valuable. I care about what they say. For too long, many of my girls have been told to shut up. I really believe in encouraging my students to rethink their power and the positive attributes they possess and bring from home. Some students are from Tijuana and other parts of Mexico. I always tell them to speak their mind. Sana Cisneros is a Latina author who explored themes associated with Latina identity and empowerment in her novels. She uses, so again, she begins to look at ways in which to engage students through literacy, to talk about these particular themes of voice, of engagement. Okay, so it's connected to literacy work, but having an understanding of her students. So she just didn't pick something just out of the blue, but it was very intentional. Tommy's bond with the students was evident in the following conversation about Latino in his history books. So this is interaction between Tommy and the students. So Tommy says, so you are heroes and role models to many of your family members and community. You know that, right? In some books, Latino history is not present, but we can feel it in our existence. We are living history. We are lucky to live so close to Tijuana. Not many students have that in their lives. We are lucky. Ernesto. Maestro, teacher, you're the only teacher that I knew that sees living next to Mexico as a reward. I never thought about this in that way. It's cool to have this in our history. It should be in our history books. I get you, Maestro. Jaime. But we still do not get mentioned in books. My dad and abuelo grew up on the border and built factories and helped build train tracks, too. They are never mentioned. I think they are heroes first, then we come next. It is the right order. Tommy, those are powerful words, Jaime. I think you made us all feel good. It's like we have said, we can feel it. So again, the physical closeness to the border, but the history that exists with many of our students, many of the students that you have, certainly exist. And in these particular instances, he's making those critical links and talking about it via the books and via not the books, okay? And many of our students, for example, in contemporary times, Mexican American Studies in this past summer got a positive vibe. So things are changing in terms of the way in which particular curriculum is used. In this instance, he's making an intentional attempt to engage students via the history books, via the history of the border region. The complexities of living in two worlds. Let me stop right here. Could living in two worlds be applicable to our own lives? What's an everyday experience?
Work and home.
Work at home, definitely. Any other? Families, right? You have the families that you like. You're engaged.
Parts of the family that you like.
Barbecues.
Right, Thanksgiving's right around the corner.
Friends.
Friends, communities, and then there's a sort of a script that's built in when you go to a different place.
Yeah.
Questions that you ask. I know that my grandfather didn't like us wearing long hair. He would always be like, gotta cut it. Like, but these two worlds are both important because we're always engaged in them. But in terms of our kids, students that we work with, and this is applicable to Latino and non-Latino populations, they're in two worlds. I have a lot of white students, again, home and school. At home, for whatever reasons, they act a certain way, and you know this from experience. And in school, right? What we know from adolescent period, the way that they socialize, the way that they engage. I recommend that you read a lot of Valenzuela's work on sort of the map of the school of schools. So we have the nerds, we have the jocks, we have the immigrants, the non-immigrants, the elites, the non-elites, cosmopolitan hierarchies that exist. In this particular instance, these two worlds come together. And Marisol talks a lot about this different world. And one example, Marisol had a conversation with students about living in two worlds. She was a student at work and constantly linked her teaching with Minchu's novel and testimony. She's talking about the book Yo, Rigoberta Minchu, which is the Guatemalteca literature on the way it's driven by testimony. Those of you that like to read testimony about the treatment of women in Guatemala, which is also very applicable to women and in a broad sense of victims at a national and international level. So this is what she said to her students. So Marisol, we are constantly living in two worlds, Tijuana and Oro Vista. These type of borders clash all the time, like in Rigoberta's life. Again, she's linking it to curriculum and to the novel. She's linking it to the novel that they've read. She says we are in multiple worlds. What does this all mean to us? Maria, Maestra, it is like you have 2 or 3 spaces. We live in Rigoberta Minchu was living in like 5 spaces or more. She was indigenous, a daughter. Sometimes I feel like that being in Oro Vista and border, it is hard because you have to fit in. I hate this. I need my space. So the research continues to tell us that kids' identity, once they walk into schools, are shaped. And they become really rigid. And the time they leave, we could bring in adolescent theory, we could bring in peer socialization, is that an identity is being formed. And the question that I have for all of you is, do we have time and space to explore their identities, to engage in those assets, and to bring them out? Marisol is using critical literacy in novels to engage in those discussions. Lisa says, no, Minchu was in 2 worlds, in a Spanish and an Indian world. That is how many of us live. We live in 2 worlds. You have to always adapt and move from space to space. It is hard to always adapt, but I like it. In Oro Vista, I talk in Spanish and in English. At home, Spanish. And at school, English and other language. But what I'm referring to is the way high school kids talk. We have a lot of research that says a lot of the way kids are talking in high school are very reflective of texting. are very reflective of Snapchat, are very reflective of this particular language and vernacular. My kids, my two boys, sometimes I'm like, what are you saying? What are you saying? Where is a dictionary for this? In Spanish and in English, because it transfers. If you're not talking okay in English, guess what? You're also not talking okay in Spanish. So I'm like, we have to sort of recognize that there are the languages that kids speak in high school that are valuable to them, that inform their identity, that inform who they are. And it must be shared. They must be validated. Not to say that we want kids speaking in a certain way in our classrooms, but there's got to be a way, and this is where a lot of scholars and theorists clash, is when is it that we accept students' language and intersect that with our work, in our writings, in our academic work? Where is that intersect? And where is it where we accept it and then we either expand on it or we limit them? Most of the time, high school kids' language, whether it's the community, neighborhood, most of the time it's sort of constrained or eliminated. To the point where if you don't speak fluently in English or have the academic or have the sort of social language that's accepted, that sort of is more vivid in high schools. In particular, in high schools in California that I visited. So again, we see that kids, and you know this, their voices are systematically sort of quieted. So she's engaging in that conversation through novels. Marisol stated that her students really enjoy talking about their identities at school. The third particular finding, so this is Tommy. So Tommy did something really interesting, and I'm going to send Dr. Carla the mural that they painted. In this particular high school, Tommy taught history. He connected it to art. So again, most of the important work that in my opinion was happening occurred outside the classroom. So across the semester, Tommy witnessed Latino youth developing extraordinary paintings linked to their lives. Many of the murals drew from Chicano history that Tommy integrated in his curriculum. The following expert students describe aspects of their murals, and I'll just read Amanda's. What she says, after painting part of the mural. I live here in the poor side of Oro Vista, so I painted us near the border. I love it. Then we have the rich side, far away from the border. I always get looked at when going there, so I drew those rich homes. These two worlds are always here and clashing. Nothing changes. So they're linking history with art, and at the same time, sort of making these observations about their surroundings. Again, learning, being engaged academically and also artistically. El compromiso, the commitment and activism. So a lot of Anzaldua's and Ferry's work is not just about being critiquing the schools or critiquing teachers, but it's also about forgetting, for re-engaging, for being willing to sort of say, okay, I understand what's going on. I still love you. I still care about you. I still want you to do your best, regardless. That sort of moral obligation that we have as educators to make youth understand the importance of letting things go, revitalizing, and sort of expanding on the notions of love. And so with Marisol and with Tommy, I've only observed them for a year, but if I were to go back, I would probably see more notions of this. So in critical literacy activities, we're using Marisol's classroom to expand on notions of activism. Marisol used a writing project to help students reflect on their identity and beliefs about social justice and activism. Marisol spent many class periods with her students thinking about issues related to border and their identity as Latino youth, and encouraged her students to think beyond the physical border. Marisol emphasized with her students to really think about the borders that limit who they are in school and home. Her students developed a magazine that focused on issues impacting youth in the border. We had a lot of Latino students that were gay, lesbian, transgender, various identities. Marisol took it upon herself with her colleagues to create a magazine to actually document and write about this through essays, poetry, short story, and narrative. So they used this magazine as a way to have this sort of civil and academic sort of activism. So they weren't going out the streets and protesting, but they actually did something that is done in many high schools, which is the school newspaper or school journalism. But within the border pedagogy lens, they actually linked into the lives of students, to the complexities of their identities, and to the assets that exist within them. So they built this magazine, and I got handed one. And when they gave me the magazine, it looked something like this, paper. But it was all student-driven. Everything from the title, their poems, they were critiquing the government, they were critiquing everything, they were critiquing their teachers, but in a very loving way. Can you critique and be loving and be caring? Yes. Yes. How do students participate in projects associated with activism on the border? He linked the social studies curriculum with content that's about both sides of the border. Tommy emphasized that he tried to make youth build unity as much as possible to address existing issues. Tommy's students engaged in multiple project focused on the needs of the Oro Vista Tijuana border community. In many instances, many of my students or his students had been picked up by immigration officers. They had been picked up and placed in detention centers. I didn't discuss this, but this is within the context. And what Tommy was saying is that once we always forgive, forget, and think about unity, and think about ways that always help the community. And so what Tommy was getting at, and many kids resisted, how can you love someone that's doing this? And he harped on it. And I'm not saying that this happened, and I'm not saying that that it was easy, but he at least talked about caring for others regardless. How do we do that? How do we engage? And so we had them do a lot of lunch drives, food drives. So across the year, this is what he said, my students give back and provide for the community, providing food and other services that are needed to help out. Regardless of how the community has treated students, I explain to them to give and build unity. And that, to me, is what gets lost in a lot of border pedagogy or cultural responsiveness. That notion of seeing beyond or seeing yourself in other people's shoes and to go from there. Now, some people would say, but wait a second, you're teaching your kids to care about people or a person that has done this? I'm saying yes. I'm saying yes. Very difficult. With my own children, I'm like, stop hitting your brother. Love him. He's looking at me. And so at a personal level, we're like, it's difficult. Now trying to make students, all our students, both Latino and non-Latino, to consider others and to think about social studies and activism and how to expand on the notions of caring, right? Going back to literature, going back to these notions of caring. If we can't model that, how can we expect our students to sort of demonstrate some of these particular skills? It's very difficult to model. It's very difficult to ask students to do something if we are not mentoring them, if we are not sort of engaged with them with these particular ideas. And so I want to stop and I want to be clear about something. Border pedagogy is not a recipe. It's not something that will sort of help ease the academic achievement. Border pedagogy is a way to engage teachers and students in a very different perspective that centralizes our understanding of kids' identity, of tapping into their multiple identities, their multiple linguistic identities, tapping into all our students. So I said before, well, can border pedagogy be used in other states? In North Carolina, researchers there have used a lot of border pedagogy to understand how Anglo and Latino kids are doing. Anglo and Latino immigrant kids from other countries are doing, because we see a lot of influence of Latino immigrants, refugee students, and others. So that's just one level. At the other level, as you know very well, many students have different identities. In California, parts of Arizona, and North Carolina in the Midwest, we see a lot of kids talking about their gender, talking about gay, lesbian, transgender issues in high school, right? And so what we're getting at here is border pedagogy is a way to engage in these conversations and these discussions. In many instances, Marisol and Tommy, I mean, they had a lot of experience. They had at least a decade of experience of just teaching their subject matter well. These teachers knew their subject matter well, and they were able to sort of find spaces where border pedagogy could intersect and be used. They didn't just come in and say, September 1st, 2017, border pedagogy, here we go. Right? Well, you set them up for failure, right? This was sort of the curriculum and the social studies work intersected with what they wanted to do. So it was very intentional and very applicable. But I wanted to share that it's not a recipe for success. Just like culturally responsive teaching, it is a way to engage, to sort of have these conversations, to consider what can be done in the classroom and what cannot be done in the classroom, right? I can't stop language policy, Prop 203. Can't. The 4-hour blocks that exist, the secondary students, both my white and non-white students, that continue to receive standardized teaching and standardized curriculum, I can't stop that. But there's a way to engage and think about these spaces. If you read the article that we wrote, me and 2 other colleagues, Marisol and Tommy explored other spaces. Marisol took them to camp, where they learned about leadership skills and they used ancient traditional practices to think about them as their identity. Tom explored the community. He had them go to, he had the students go and present issues that they had about being picked up by the police. So they went to court and the young kids actually went and said, and this is what happened. Nothing occurred, but the kids actually had a chance to talk. Again, having the civic duty, again, grounded in social studies curriculum, grounded in history and the curriculum that's used in California. So this was not just to talk about culture, but the teachers used it in an academic way to get at some of these discussion points. But I do want to emphasize that it's not a recipe that you can just take and say, well, I think that this is going to help. It's something that in some progressive high schools they've done. If you take a look at Jeffrey Duncan Andrade's work in San Francisco State, he's developed a curriculum on not border pedagogy, but critical responsive pedagogy in high school. He's written a great book on the art of critical pedagogy. Him and Dr. Ernest Morel out of NYU and UCLA have done this, where they've looked at these particular frameworks and seen how students learn in various spaces. In one instance, they were basketball coaches. In one instance, they were doing community work. So what I'm getting at here is teachers, it's very difficult for teachers to think beyond the classroom setting, beyond the four walls, because we're so used to it, right? We're so used to sort of that for some of us 9 to 5, 9 to 6, or 8 to 3 sort of time period of working with youth. But this literature and the research and some of the findings sort of are telling us, are pointing us to a direction to say, let's consider using border pedagogy let's consider these particular spaces where we can explore how it's being used for Latino and non-Latino populations. How would border pedagogy be used as a professional development? What would that look like? How would it be used in your research? How would you use qualitative research or ethnography to sort of guide some of the things that you want to do with your research, if you're taking into consideration high schools or high school youth, as an example? And so what I'm getting at here, I am doing a study with another colleague in Arizona, and we're looking at how secondary teachers enact culturally responsive pedagogy in Arizona high schools. So we're looking at some high schools in Central Phoenix to examine how in-service teachers engage. So we are observing a lot of literacy, social studies, and science teachers, STEM teachers. And so we were able to identify teachers that wanted to do this work, that they were tired of the old curriculum, and they were tired of certain things that they're tired of having low expectations, or tired of having expectations that were low and not clear. And so we have selected both Latino and non-Latino teachers. My colleague is a white scholar, and so that's what I like too. Diversity sort of helps us think about the positions that we take as researchers. It's always helpful. Those of you that are doing research, make sure the triangulation is very important. But we are thinking about an emerging pedagogy. I'm calling it emerging border pedagogy, but I'm also thinking maybe calling it something else that we can use in high schools. And this is where I want to stop. I want to stop and say, this work is ongoing. It's very fluid. I go back to that many times. The administrator there has left. She's a really critical woman. She's not there anymore. I wonder why. But I want to stop here and listen. Questions, comments about anything that you read or anything that I talked about. And then I want you to think about, what can we actually do in school? What could be a plan of action? So, questions and comments?
Was that administrator critical to helping you or critical against you?
She was helpful. She gave me access to the school. She believed in linking curriculum with culturally responsive pedagogy. Yes, question.
So then tell me about the culture of the town, because you said it's very close to the border, but why would she be gone? Is it like the school district is not really conducive to that?
My sense is, as you know, going into particular schools, there is a culture that is expected. Most administrators, a lot of administrators want certain things run a certain way, and they certainly don't want a woman telling them what to do. That's the honest. I talked to her. She didn't give me the dirt. She was very emotional, but they were taking her work in a different direction. And in other words, when you're cooking and have this great soup and it's perfect, everyone loves it. Then you got Joe Schmo. Wait a second. You can't serve that. You can't serve it. If you serve it, it looks bad on you. Your vision, your perspective, your expectations. So that's part of it. She found another school. She's going to open up another school.
Was she Latina?
Yes.
Is the town have a good Latino mix, or is it predominantly Anglo, or is it?
It's 60% Latino, 30% women, and the other are other. We get a lot of people from Mexico, Central Mexico, and there's a lot of people that transient from San Diego to Los Angeles, but it's mostly 50-50, 60-40.
Who runs it?
That school district, mostly Latino administrators.
Okay, so that's something so interesting to me, because we have a similar situation.
Yeah, mostly Latino administrators. So again, just because you're a Latino doesn't mean you're going to do it, or you're African American, or a critical white administrator. It doesn't mean that you're going to do that. You're going to sort of engage in these discussions. Yes. Question.
So I teach in a school a lot like this, Oro Vista. It's a non-traditional school that other people consider the dumping ground, but certainly is not the case for our kids. They're not dumping ground material.
Yes.
But one thing that I've noticed about our population that's similar along the lines to your concept of newcomers is the students that missed lots of school, even if they're not newcomers, like crossing the border, but they grew up in Tucson, they missed 60% absent rate, right? And so they come in way, way behind grade level. Is that included in newcomers? Is that something parallel to newcomers? How would we classify that type of student?
We classify them as they're not classified as newcomers. They're classified as either transient or having unparalleled experiences, schooling experiences. Mm-hmm. Some of them are not even English learners. They speak English, speak social English well. Yep. But because they miss school because of work, because of family issues, because of other factors, they miss a lot of days. Unfortunately, most of those students do not graduate on time because there's an age limit. In Tennessee, for example, I did a study with another colleague of mine, and in Tennessee, you could graduate, the age limit was 19. So we would get newcomers from different countries that would come in at 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Sometimes it took them like 5-6 years to graduate, but they got that 19. It was 21, not 19, 21. It was lowered to 19. Dropout rates went way up. It's crazy. And so I understand that, and it's very difficult. I'm curious if administrators have these discussions, because I know they all want the best for students. I've seen it.
Yeah, that's something my administrators brought up to me, is that this is kind of the pattern that we see when we have the chronic absenteeism at our location, because that's what we get. We get the absentee kids from the other schools, right? And yeah.
One thing I was going to say about the previous conversation with communities that have leadership of folks like that are Latino or Black, I feel like there is a culture of our country that tries to homogenize people into one little, this is what this looks like, this is what that looks like. And I think there's a lot of overcompensation that goes on, like, well, I might be a Latino administrator, but I'm not going to do anything different just because of that, and I think that's where heads roll in the wrong direction, and they don't collaborate and figure out a new way. What does it look like now? Now that it's not all white people in the power, in the powerful positions. What does it look like now? I don't think as a country we've really figured that out necessarily.
What was that? Question back there, yes.
Well, so I'm hearing that it's obvious that there's a lot of things going on in our students' lives. Yes. Whether it's immigration or family matters or language matters or gang matters, there's a lot going on that they bring with them into the classroom. And as a science and engineering teacher, I would like to focus on what we're supposed to be focusing on in the classroom and not let those things become distractions or disturbances. So am I doing my students a disservice by saying leave all the drama in the hallway and come in here and let's focus on this?
I don't think. I think I'll answer it two ways. One, I think that your preparation, your everyday preparation, and your dedication to your profession as a teacher is really key. It sounds like you are dedicated to your students. There's this research and this work wants you as a teacher, educator, future researcher to consider their lives, to consider their experiences, and to think about ways in which perhaps our lessons could be different. Perhaps. So perhaps, and this is nothing new, Luis Moll out of University of Arizona did a large study on how he used funds of knowledge in science curriculum and how he engaged students' lives and used meaningful, rich, rigorous curriculum to engage youth academically. So I think that accept, so understanding the drama that exists, I mean, that's like it every day. Like, we would have kids, one period, they're friends, the second period, they hate each other, or breakups.
Oh, yeah.
So these are the this is the peer socialization process, where I think what you're getting at is deeper issues. Chronic absenteeism is systematic and is a result of other things. Both political, non-political, immigration, non-immigration, work. A lot of our kids work, right? Some of you are saying, how do they get work permits? Guess what? They find a way, because if you don't have food at home or to pay the gas bill or electricity, guess what? It impacts you. And so I think that by acknowledging their lives and understanding, and then figuring out, well, how can I, and this is where I can't tell you if you know I can't speak about your students, but just know that you're very important to them, right? That you might be the only one that cares in the school, right? Right? As a science teacher, and and the passion that you present with your work, right? And again, you know your students, but I guess to engage in conversations, and also don't force. I'm like, so tell me why you're undocumented from Africa and you're struggling. Tell me. Come on. Again, that's a savior mentality. This is very natural. This is a fluid. Like we create spaces for kids to sort of engage in these conversations. They did it through art, through discussions, through literature circles. So it's something that, again, not a recipe. However, the answer, going back to your important question, because I get it all the time, is, have you ever experimented, perhaps, with linking a mini lesson or a particular unit, maybe during before the school's over, as an example, where you link perhaps some of the students' experiences in your lectures or in your lesson plans? There's something where you have time to experiment, right? Where you can actually see, okay, I did what's expected of me. Let me play around with the curriculum a little bit. How can I use some of this? Where is there space? In some of the work that I've done in Central High School in Arizona, where students were able to find a lot of space, it's called zero period. It's where a lot of kids that missed a period or two go, they're there for 50 minutes and they get extra homework that they missed, or just things that went on. A lot of the teachers would go in there and have conversations, not about the work, but about what was going on. And it's different in different schools, but to me it's high expectations for your kids always. And we can't teach that, right? We talk about it, but maintain those high expectations and think about these spaces of where you can perhaps link part of border pedagogy with your lesson or culture responsive teaching. And sometimes we don't even call it. We don't call it that. We call it something that's modern, using hip hop and literacy. That's what we see a lot. Using students' art, poetry. Play around with kids. They'll figure it out. They will figure it out.
Who did the Funds of Knowledge research?
Luis Moll.
Moll? How do you
Luis Moll. He's probably one of the pioneers, but also he draws a lot of Bordeaux's work. So I think that's something that's ingrained in the work that Dr. Karlovac and Roscoe and others are going to be doing. So he does a lot of really good work. But again, having those expectations. Yes?
So I wanted to thank you for your research, Dr. Ramirez, because you, in a very articulate and caring way, described my life. You really did. I'm a border child. I was born and raised 5 minutes here from the border with Alabama and Douglas. And everything that you described was just touching me. It was just, filling me as I was going, because I think you have this tendency to become so polarized a lot of times when you remove yourself from the border and then you come back from the border, you're just so polarized that you don't necessarily see how important it is to continue to be connected. But I was that child. I was a ni de aquí ni de allá child, you know, and that really spoke to me and continues to speak to me on many different levels. So, and it's important, I think, that we connect with our kids. I was that kid that those teachers didn't connect with. And they didn't understand what I was having to live with in having my family on both sides of the border and having 2 houses on both sides of the border, crossing every day at times.
Yeah, I met a young girl who crossed the border. She was she crossed the border every single day with her mom and her sister to attend school in California. So they would take, they would cross the Tijuana border. And if you ever go to Tijuana, you have 3 ways to cross. Fast way, it's called the Sentry. 5 minutes, you can cross. Then you have the other way, it takes you an hour and a half or 2 hours to cross because of border checking. And so she would spend at least an hour and a half waiting in the car and then drive another 30 minutes to go. And she did this every single day, right? And she still had a smile, right? Which is incredible. As an adult, we can't do that. But also what's important is to understand the lives of our students. A lot of my kids, not Latino, not Latino, have these struggles, right? Just again, recognizing, figuring out. Many times, some of my pre-service teachers at Central connected with kids through football. They were the coaches or they were assistant coaches, and they would meet with them and talk about it in other spaces through sports. Some of the students had journalism clubs where they would talk about various things. So they weren't good in English, but they liked learning. They liked talking in groups. Like they do the journalism report. So they would go in, and again, the teachers would check in, sometimes leading talks. But again, finding the spaces where you learn about your kids as much as possible. Other questions or comments? Yes, Dr. Carl.
I wanted to know what we've covered so far with knowing your students. Some of the most, from what I've seen, some of the most greatest conversations and answers and questions you get in classrooms is when they're able to associate their personal experiences or their personal background or their personal interpretations of the world and sharing them with the class. They feel confident enough to share that it is relevant to a classroom setting.
Yes.
At the same time, too, though, one thing that I've always, you mentioned 2 worlds. I've noticed with some students, and maybe the majority of students, school and home are 2 different worlds that to them can never really be interlinked.
Yes.
They're exclusively separate.
Yes.
So whenever I hear teachers complain that so-and-so students are not doing homework, it's like, well, think about yourself when you were in their shoes. School was over when the bell rang.
Right.
You know, life began after the bell, you know, or, you know, school life begins when the bell rings,
Right.
you know, and what are you doing in class that kind of brings the 2 together, you know? And one of my things too is what can we do from the school to bring up to the home or the community?
Yes.
Because you really can't instill, and this is my interpretation, you really can't instill the value of education in students regardless if they're at risk, if they're newcomers, if they're, you know, your average student. If they can't see the results, the fruits of their labor out where they're at, in the streets, in anywhere. And I think that's why a lot of students are some students have a hard time staying in school or wanting to stay in school because they don't feel that what they do for each class is relevant or is something that can be applied outside.
Yes.
And it can go from language to personal beliefs or, yeah. But how do we, I guess my question is, what are some steps we can start considering to start, you know, connecting those 2 worlds?
In California, there's a lot of engagement between high schools and community colleges, meaning there are a lot of kids that, for whatever reason, can't make it to high school. There's issues there. There's been a study in Riverside where high school kids begin attending community colleges with instructors that are teaching them social studies. Part of the curriculum linked to the California curriculum for high school. And so they're exploring the way in which community colleges engage junior and senior year, not freshmen and sophomore, but juniors and a lot of seniors. So there is some engagement there, but I like the comments, like, how are we making things relevant and clear for kids, for high school kids, in particular high school kids, so that they know that there's a vision there. But unfortunately, we're finding other factors.
Right.
And so our job is to critique those factors, but to also be innovative and have some, and to engage in creativity about what we do in the classroom. Because what I talked to you about, the issue, it's been going on for more than 50 years. In some instances, 100 years. It's just about 100 years of indigenous populations. It's broader, but I want to bring it to contemporary times to think about what can we do as teachers, educators, and future researchers in schools, not just here, but I said, border pedagogy is also metaphysical. It is expanded across. In many instances, I think that's where the research is taking us. How do we sort of investigate the way in which kids feel about themselves? What if you are white? What if you are middle class? But you have notions of border duality? What does that look like? How are teachers responding? Are there spaces available? Right? So we focus it on Latino, but then we start to broaden it. Right? So I highly recommend that you engage in the works of Ph.D, Luis Moore, Gloria Anzaldua's work, Dr. Carla Buck's work as well. She's done work on border pedagogy, critical responsive teaching, and others to consider what you can do in your particular research or your particular schools or your community. So I want to any more questions or comments? Yes.
I don't know how many folks that are here, but for a lot of our students, they teach in schools where kids cross the border every day to come to school. And in most of these schools, there is a silencing about the fact that kids cross the border. We don't want anybody to know who's crossing. We pretend like it doesn't exist. And so it's almost a charade on some levels. And part of that attempt to turn our back on the reality of who our students are in some of these schools that our students work with has to do with the silencing of their language. And I understand that there's laws, and I understand we can't give direct instruction, but in some of these schools, there is a belief that the kids can't speak Spanish at all in the school. So the teachers stop them from speaking in the hallways.
Right.
They stop them from speaking to each other in Spanish in groups. And I just wonder if you looked at any of the research on the impact of taking students' language from them, their first language from them, and how that then alienates them from the school and develops this lack of motivation. Because we have a lot of students who don't understand why our students are not engaged or unmotivated, and they want to study the motivation issue, but how does the language problem fit in that engagement motivation equation?
Yes, in the 1920s and 30s, most of my mentor teachers that grew up during that time were hit or speaking Spanish in Arizona for a fact. In a boarding school, before the new boarding school, many were discouraged in various ways, physical ways, or not for speaking the particular English language. In 2017, we continue to see what I call this traumatic, syndrome that is occurring with their students who are being told not to sleep in their home community. So we are seeing a lot of kids disengaged because they're not seen as complete human beings. Meaning that if I can have a conversation about a movie that I saw in Spanish or another language, or I can engage in conversation with my friends during passing periods, during lunch, then automatically I see school as a failure. because the school doesn't see me or my language as an asset. And so many students see themselves as failures simply because of their lack of English and simply because their lack of actually being able to use something that they've been using for the past 20, 30 years. And so we are seeing more linguistic trauma occur. The work of Lucila Elk out of UT San Antonio talks about linguistic violence, meaning when you tell a child not to speak Spanish, to only speak English, it has notions of linguistic violence, meaning that you are, as a teacher or educator, positioning yourself with a sense of power that comes from you knowing these codes of conduct, or these language codes of conduct. And when you begin to enact power, you begin to say, this language is appropriate and useful, and the other should remain the other. Going back to the framework of border pedagogy, going back to the shadow, living in the shadow and the margins. And so we're seeing a lot in elementary, all the way to 12th grade, even in college. We have a lot of students that won't speak up, right?
They might not even know that's what's happening.
No,
they might not be able to comprehend that this is why I feel this way without realizing it.
And they also see that their parents are going through the same thing. So if particular states or particular policies are specifically stating this about a group, that type of those particular perspectives trickle down to the community. They trickle down to the churches. They trickle down to the home. So we go from a macro to sort of this micro aspect of it, where parents, community members say, well, no hablas español, no inglés, no speak Spanish, speak English. Or indigenous language, speak English. Because it goes back to the codes, these particular codes that are accepted. Again, going back to Giroux's work of power structures, right? And I know that we begin to politicize school, which we should and critique, but we are seeing the ramifications of linguistic violence in many schools. California, Arizona, across. Yes.
But it starts on the paperwork that the kids' parents have to fill out when they're enrolled in schools. They ask the 3 questions, which are on the kids.
Yep.
It starts then.
Yes.
And then they're identified. You have to test them. How much English do they have or don't have?
And the assessments are very
difficult.
Yes.
I did it for a year. They're very difficult.
Yes.
They feel like they're setting them up to fail.
Yes.
So they're difficult.
They're very difficult.
And the support is not there to sort of develop.
It's not
develop language.
They're supposed to be within 4 hours. Not 4 hours.
So the question is, I wonder why these things exist. Right? Right? Why these things exist?
I think all of this is pointing at, and I've heard this hinted several times, but it has to do some with relevancy, but the historical and broader seems to be in every case that it is cultural segregation in the institution, and so it's built in and it's structured and it's at every level, and it's levels of financial and where your family's demographic is, wherever you live. I mean, it doesn't matter if, like you're saying, it's Tennessee or West Virginia. It doesn't matter what your race is. It doesn't. It's your economic status, and what kind of education you get depends a lot on what access you have.
So we start looking at power structures and how it influence the academic trajectory of students, but also teachers. We put teachers in vulnerable positions. If a principal tells you, you need to do this, this, and this, and you want to make sure you keep your job, and you want to make sure you get tenure, and you want to make sure all these things, and you got bills, you got family. This is where you're challenged. Am I going to speak up for my kids and advocate for them? Or Latino and non-Latino? Or do I sort of just assimilate, which I said previously, that's what happens. That's what typically happens. Typically teachers assimilate to the culture of the school, right? It happens. I mean, that's what we see.
I have access to, I found, a friend told me about a legal firm. So it's an entire firm you have access to for $10 a month. As an individual, I think it's $20 for a whole family. I signed my family up. I've used them several times. They're amazing. They're high integrity. They're in all 50 states. And for $10, you don't need to pay them more than 1 month. But, if you want to continue, that's what it is. But they will get back to you within, I don't know, it's 8 business hours. It's ridiculous. You can't go pay someone a retainer of $5,000 and get that kind of service anywhere. And so they'll tell you the law quickly, and they'll help you in any case, and they'll make a case for you, and they'll file paperwork and everything. It's pretty amazing. If you want to know, contact me. I don't know. I'll tell you how, because that is so important. It levels the playing field in so many ways. It's incredible.
I think having access to that information is really key to it. I want to reiterate that these issues that I talked about and I've examined across the study are nothing new. The way I'm getting at it via Board of Pedagogy framework, inclusive responsive education, is sort of engaging in that conversation and seeing what comes out. The teachers here enacted Board of Pedagogy outside the classroom. Think about that, right? So the teachers were astute in saying, I'm gonna take the curriculum outside, I'm gonna do this. Because inside the classroom, you guys know that there's still a lot of things that limit you as a teacher, as an educator. And this is where you begin to reflect on your ideology and your beliefs. Do I want to advocate for my students and do these things? How do I do them? How do I position myself as a science teacher to engage? And these are the questions. So the issue here is, and this is what my concern has always been, the teachers get a chance to actually reflect on their practices, on what's going on. Now we know for a fact that they do not. And if they do, which is rare, it's specifically focused on the standardization movement. Are you teaching to the test? These topics that come up. Versus, how well do you know your students? And can you engage them using this particular lens or this perspective? That rarely happens. I'll be honest to say, at a national level, it doesn't happen. So this is just for you to engage, to think about the possibilities of what could happen in schools and communities in Arizona. But again, Board of Pedagogy is also used in other places where we're far away from the border. Far away. I'm going to leave you with this. Actually, can that other group listen?
Yes.
Do you have questions, my Pima students? Any questions? I haven't been able to engage you as much, but any questions, ladies and gentlemen, any questions that you may have?
They're muted on their end.
In Tucson, push the mute button.
Oh, there's Patrice. Is that Patricia?
Yeah, in the back.
Kevin has a question.
I think we're okay.
Okay. Now we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So this is moving way back, but you said that your research found that school culture and policy have a bigger influence on what kind of teacher you are than your personal values or beliefs. So what do you see as the benefits or the downsides of making that school policy, that school culture, more in line to everything you talked about with Board of Pedagogy?
So if school policy, for example, if language policy were actually student-centered, I think kids in high school will have access to richer curriculum and will see the schooling experiences as more positive and productive, and could actually not only help kids that do bad, but also will expand the curriculum for other youth, white youth, that are historically been fed the particular curriculum that turns them into certain type of students. So I do think that if policy is reflective of the needs of students, and in a way student-centered, but also linked to what teachers feel should happen in their school, meaning having a relevant curriculum, having spaces to learn about their kids, and maintaining expectations high, and linking them to a college pipeline, I think then that could perhaps be a result. Of course, them being ideological, but as I said earlier on, I'm very optimistic. In many schools, we have seen where school districts take a student-centered approach and take a critical teacher approach, and we're seeing a significant impact on many students, and also the impact on many communities, because parents begin to have a higher level of engagement. This is not to say that because you're doing CRT, you'll have more parents, but you see it change. Oh, they're considering our background, they're considering our family history. So thank you for the question, because that's where we want to go. But how can we pilot some of this work to present to school districts and school boards that there's actually a positive correlation with some of this work in terms of academic achievement, the college pipeline, and again, in Tennessee, when the age limit went from 21 to 19, dropout rates skyrocketed, and guess what? More kids were put in prison, okay? More kids had issues with police, and more kids were unemployed. So guess what? There are major cultural and economic implications when we talk about curriculum and teacher development. So that question is a segue. Thank you very much for the question. Is a segue for what I have for you is, after this, I'm going to talk to Dr. Karlovic about an action plan. What can you do? What are a couple of things that you can do in your school and your research, if you're going that direction, that you could perhaps consider this semester or next semester, that perhaps could influence some of your work? And I would like to have still connect with Dr. Karlovic about perhaps coming back in the spring and seeing what we've done and continuing this conversation at a deeper level. Okay, so think about what can be done in your schools, your communities, and perhaps in your emerging research, and then let's come back and in early spring or discuss these particular potential projects or ideas that you have. So I'm very hopeful that we'll come up with some ideas. I'm not giving you homework. No, this is not homework. This is more, let's think about how we can use some of this work to broaden some of our thinking. Thank you for your time. Dr. Karlovic will have my email, my Twitter account, and other things, so you can contact me at any time. You will also have access to the special issue that was published last year, where you'll find the articles on border pedagogy. Thank you, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. We'll try to reconnect in the spring. I love that idea. And these folks who are doing their research projects also have to, in that project, think about how their research is going to impact their teaching. So I'm sure that this today will have be part of their thinking about their changes. So thank you guys for staying. I know it was a really long day, but I think it was really helpful to everybody. It certainly helped me to touch base with all of you and see what you're doing. Have a good rest of the weekend, and we'll see you next month. Well, not all. But anyway.